He sealed himself off from the world after his daughter died, until a freezing little girl banged on his door at 4 a.m. and screamed, "He's not breathing." Caleb Dawson had not spoken to a child in 8 years. His house in Willow Creek stood like a mausoleum, silent and untouched, its rooms preserved in memory rather than use. The kitchen clock ticked for no one. Dust gathered like unspoken grief on the windowsills. Every morning he made black coffee, read the local newspaper, and locked the door to the bedroom that once belonged to Emma, his daughter lost too soon. People in town whispered about the man who never smiled, who paid an exact change and spoke only when necessary. But Caleb didn't care. Silence was safer. Until one freezing Monday morning, a knock at his door shattered everything. A girl, soaked from head to toe, stood barefoot on his porch holding a bundle of blankets. "Please," she whispered, "my little brother's burning up." Her eyes held no fear, only desperation. Caleb hesitated, the weight of his own past anchoring him in place, but something in her voice, fragile, stubborn, cracked open the door he thought he had sealed forever. And just like that, everything began to change. Caleb Dawson was the kind of man whose name people in Willow Creek said quietly, if at all. At 48, he had become a fixture in the town's collective imagination, a recluse, a ghost of grief walking the same path each day without ever looking up. His house sat at the edge of town, large and weathered, a once proud Victorian with peeling white paint and windows that hadn't been opened in years. It looked less like a home and more like a memory no one wanted to disturb. Caleb had lived there alone for nearly a decade, ever since the day the world broke and never put itself back together. He woke every morning at 6:03 without an alarm, brewed a pot of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat at the small kitchen table with the same cracked mug and yesterday's newspaper, even if the date on it was a lie. The kitchen clock still worked, though the ticking often felt louder than it should have in a house so quiet. The town had changed, but Caleb hadn't. He wore the same brown coat, every winter boots that had been resoled 3 times, and a flat cap pulled low enough to discourage small talk. No one knocked on his door, and he liked it that way. The mail carrier left letters in the box without pausing. The grocery store clerk learned not to ask questions. Caleb spoke when necessary, nodded instead of greeting, paid with exact change, and avoided eye contact like it burned. But the most sacred place in the house, off limits even to himself, was the room at the top of the stairs. Emma's room. The door was closed always. A faded sticker above the knob read, "Do not enter," the letters worn but still legible, drawn in purple crayon by the hand of a child who believed rules mattered. Caleb hadn't touched that door since the day they took her away. The room behind it in his mind remained untouched, unaged, a snapshot of pink curtains, stuffed animals, and tiny shoes by the bed. He couldn't bear to open it because to do so would mean acknowledging time had passed without her. And time to Caleb had stopped. People in Willow Creek speculated but never asked. Some thought he lost his wife and daughter in an accident. Others believed Emma died in her sleep. No one knew for sure, and Caleb never said. Rumors came and went, like storms, whispers in grocery aisles and murmurs during Sunday service, but they never reached his ears. He didn't go to church. He didn't attend town events. He didn't answer his phone. He lived like the world had ended and no one else noticed. On rare days, children would ride bikes past his house, daring each other to touch the fence. "That's the haunted place," they'd say. "That's where the ghost man lives." But Caleb was no ghost. He breathed. He cooked. He remembered birthdays he never celebrated. He lived technically. But he had sealed himself off from the world with the same care he sealed Emma's door, firm, deliberate, and with no intention of ever opening it again. Or so he thought. The house Caleb Dawson lived in was too big for one man, especially one who didn't speak, didn't entertain, and didn't let time inside. It loomed at the edge of Willow Creek like a forgotten monument, 3 stories of decaying elegance wrapped in silence. The white paint had long since turned gray, chipped by rain, and Kentucky winds that never asked permission. The porch creaked even when no one walked across it. Inside, the air felt colder than outside, especially in winter, not because the heat didn't work, but because Caleb rarely turned it on. It felt wrong to warm a house meant for a family that no longer existed. The rooms were frozen in time, thick drapes, drawn tight dust coating every surface, not touched by routine. The living room still held the worn leather couch he and Emma used to lie on during thunderstorms, her head tucked under his arm, her tiny hand resting on his chest. A small dent in the cushion still hinted at the curve of her weight. Caleb never sat there anymore. He preferred the kitchen chair, hard and unyielding, where nothing could sneak up on him, not comfort, not memory. But the heart of the house, the one place that both pulled at him and pushed him away, was upstairs at the end of the narrow hallway behind a white wooden door with a fading sticker that read, "Emma's Room." The sticker had hearts drawn around it, little glittery remnants of a time when she still believed in magic. The doorknob, once gold and shiny, was now tarnished, untouched for years. Caleb hadn't stepped foot in that room since the day he came home from the hospital with her backpack and no child. He had locked the door quietly without ceremony and walked away. That was 8 years ago. Since then, the door had become a boundary, sacred and immovable, separating the man he had been from the shell he became. Some nights he stood outside at hand, hovering over the knob, heart thudding like a drumbeat of ghosts. He would press his palm against the wood and whisper apologies that no one could hear. He imagined the room inside just as she had left it, a twin bed with a unicorn blanket, shelves lined with books about dragons and stars, drawings taped to the wall that she had once proudly shown him after school. In his mind, the window still caught the afternoon light just right, and the curtains danced softly in the breeze. But he didn't know if that was true anymore. The dust had surely thickened, the crayons dried out the stuffed animals, stiff with time. He refused to find out. Better to let memory keep the room alive than let reality confirm it had died. The rest of the house obeyed the same logic, plates untouched in cabinets, family photos turned face down on side tables, coats still hanging by the door in sizes no one wore. Caleb moved through it like a visitor in a museum, built to honor a life that had ended abruptly without warning. The silence was so complete that even the floorboards creaked with restraint, as if the house itself mourned with him. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a shell wrapped around grief, kept standing by habit and fear. And at its cold, locked center sat the room that once held laughter, bedtime stories, and everything Caleb had ever loved. Caleb Dawson lived by ritual, not by choice, but by necessity. It was the only way he knew how to exist without falling apart. Every morning began at exactly 6:03 a.m., not 6:0, not 6:05. His body had long since internalized the rhythm, no need for alarms or clocks. He would rise from the same side of the bed, pull on the same worn flannel shirt, and shuffle into the kitchen with the quiet precision of a man trying not to disturb ghosts. The house remained still as if holding its breath, and Caleb liked it that way. He filled the kettle to the same mark on its side and waited in silence as it hissed and steamed. The coffee grounds were always measured, never eyeballed. He didn't drink it for flavor or pleasure. It was black, bitter, and scalding, but because it marked the start of a new day, the beginning of another 24 hours to survive. He poured the coffee into his chipped ceramic mug, the one with the faded blue tree that Emma had once given him for Father's Day, and sat at the small table by the window that never opened. There, beside the window, that overlooked a backyard gone wild with weeds and forgotten flowers, he unfolded the local paper. He never cared about the headlines. Politics, crime, weather, none of it mattered. He wasn't reading to learn anything new. He read because he always had, because a day without the newspaper felt unanchored, like trying to walk on ice with bare feet. Sometimes he would trace his finger over the crossword puzzle, but never fill in the answers. That required too much thinking, too much of a connection to words and people and clever clues. The silence around him was a comfort, a companion that never demanded anything. Caleb didn't turn on the radio. He didn't listen to music. The only sounds in the house came from the occasional creak of wood settling or the slow drip of the bathroom faucet. He liked it that way. Words from other people carried weight, and he had grown tired of carrying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. In town, he was a man of few nods and fewer words. He bought the same groceries every Thursday morning: eggs, bread, black coffee grounds, canned soup, and apples, if they looked decent. The cashier at Taylor's Market knew better than to ask how he was doing. No one asked him anything anymore. The barber stopped offering trims after the fifth silent refusal. Neighbors learned not to wave. Even the postman, a cheerful young man named Lucas, eventually stopped saying hello and simply left the mail without a glance. Caleb had become invisible by design. He didn't want connection, didn't need pity, didn't trust kindness. People meant pain, and silence meant control. And in Caleb's world, control was survival. Everything outside of that routine, every knock at the door, every unexpected ring of the landline he refused to disconnect, was a threat to the fragile equilibrium he had built around himself. He didn't know what day it was. He didn't care. Monday felt like Thursday, and Thursday might as well have been Sunday. As long as the coffee was hot, the paper was dry, and the front door remained closed, Caleb could make it through one more day pretending he wasn't still bleeding inside. At the end of the second-floor hallway, just past the faded wallpaper and the uneven floorboard Caleb never fixed, stood a single door that had not been opened in 8 years. It was white, though time, and dust had dulled it to a tired gray, with edges slightly worn from where Emma used to push it open with both hands, laughing, running alive. But what stopped Caleb every time, what anchored his breath to his chest and rooted his feet to the floor, was the line of waxy red crayon scrawled across a sheet of pink construction paper, now yellowed with age, taped just below the doorknob. The childish handwriting read, "Do not enter. Emma's room." The letters were large, uneven, stubborn, each stroke pressed hard, as if the little girl who wrote them had meant every letter as a law. Some of the wax still shimmered faintly, catching slivers of hallway light through a narrow, dust-smudged window. She had drawn 2 stick figures below the words. One was smiling with pigtails, clearly meant to be her, and the other was a man with big shoes and no mouth. Caleb had stared at that drawing more times than he could count, always wondering why she hadn't given him a mouth. Had she seen something even then? Something he had tried to hide? Maybe she knew children always knew more than adults believed. He never removed the sign. Not after the funeral. Not after the neighbors stopped coming by with casseroles. Not after the months slipped into years and he stopped counting them. The tape had curled at the corners, but the paper still held clinging to the door like a sentinel. Every time he passed it, the air felt different, heavier, like the hallway itself bowed under the weight of what was behind that door. Sometimes in the quiet hours of early morning, when the coffee hadn't yet dulled his nerves, Caleb would pause, his fingers grazing the wood just beneath the sign. He never touched the knob. That would be too final, too much, like giving in to something he couldn't undo. The room beyond that door wasn't just a bedroom. It was a sealed world, a time capsule of a life paused mid-breath. He imagined dust layering over the unicorn posters, the bookshelf still holding dog-eared paperbacks she used to read under the covers with a flashlight, the tiny shoes lined up beneath the window waiting for a girl who would never wear them again. And above all, the sign remained the same childish command written in bright red wax by hands that hadn't yet known heartbreak. Caleb could never bring himself to cross it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. That door wasn't locked with a key. It was locked with memory, with guilt, with the unbearable tenderness of a love interrupted. It was her last message to the world, the final piece of her untouched by grief, and in honoring it, Caleb felt like he was keeping her alive just a little longer. So the sign stayed, and the door stayed closed. Because sometimes the only way to survive grief was to obey the rules a child had left behind. Caleb was not a man easily startled, not anymore. Years of isolation had dulled his reflexes and trained his senses to ignore everything beyond his own breath and the sounds of an old house aging around him. The creaks in the floorboards, the moan of wind through the chimney, the occasional shudder from a water pipe. These were familiar sounds, part of the silence he had grown used to. But that morning, or rather that hour that teetered on the edge of night and dawn, something different broke through. A sound too foreign to be ignored. 3 faint knocks, soft, hesitant, like someone afraid of waking a ghost. Caleb stirred in bed, unsure at first whether the sound had been real or born from a dream. He lay still, heart slow but aware, his eyes adjusting to the dark that blanketed the room. Then came a 4th knock, slightly louder, urgent but still small, his brows furrowed. No one knocked on his door. No one ever came out this far to the edge of Willow Creek, especially not before the sun had even thought about rising. For a long second he didn't move, almost hoping the sound wouldn't return. But it did. A fifth knock this time, followed by a muffled voice. He couldn't make out the words, just that it was high-pitched, panicked, and young, very young. Caleb sat up slowly, every joint protesting, as if trying to warn him not to break the sacred routine. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cold wood slapping at the soles of his feet. The room was dark except for the faint gray light bleeding through the slats of the blinds. Grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand, he shuffled out of the room down the hallway past Emma's door, where his pace unconsciously slowed as always, and then down the narrow staircase that creaked under his weight. Another knock, then the voice again. Closer now. Please. Please. Caleb froze at the bottom step. That wasn't his imagination. That was a child, a girl, saying please like her soul depended on it. He crossed the living room quickly, the beam from his flashlight bouncing across dust-covered furniture and half-forgotten corners of his world. When he reached the front door, he hesitated, hand hovering over the knob. His heart was thudding now, not from fear exactly, but from something more primal, a sudden sense that the stillness he had lived in for years was about to be ruptured. Another knock, then the voice again, clear this time, terrified. He's not breathing. Caleb threw open the door. The cold slapped him hard in the face, icy wind rushing in like it had been waiting for permission. But he didn't feel it. All he saw was the figure standing before him. A girl, maybe 8 or 9. Hair plastered to her forehead from the cold jacket, 2 sizes too small shoes soaked through, holding something in her arms. No, not something. Someone. A little boy, maybe 3 or 4, limp, unmoving, wrapped in a blanket so thin it may as well have been paper. Her lips were trembling, eyes wide with panic. Please, she said again, breath visible in the air between them. I think my brother's dying. Caleb didn't think, didn't speak. He reached out, took the child from her arms, and pulled the girl inside. The door slammed shut behind them, the wind howling outside like a warning too late to heed. The girl stood just inside the threshold, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor, her small frame trembling not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and something deeper, raw fear. Her thin jacket was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin, and her jeans were stiff with mud and wet leaves. Her sneakers, if they could still be called that, had split soles, and her socks were 2 different colors, both saturated, leaving faint footprints behind her with each tentative step. The bundle in her arms was limp, wrapped in what looked like a bath towel that had seen better years, not just days. The little boy's face was flushed a violent red, his eyelids fluttering, his breath shallow and rapid like a bird's wing trying to beat its way out of a cage. Caleb, holding the child now in his arms, could feel the burning heat radiating through the towel as clearly as if it were fire against his chest. The girl's eyes didn't leave her brother. Her voice came so softly it barely registered, as though she'd spent the last reserves of strength knocking on his door. Do you have any medicine?" she whispered, eyes full of pleading. "He's been burning up since last night. I tried cold towels. I tried holding him real still. But now he won't wake up. I think he's really sick." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she clenched her fists at her sides as if willing herself not to cry. Caleb set the boy carefully down on the old leather couch by the fire, grabbed the wool blanket from the armrest, and covered him gently. "What's his name?" he asked, already turning to the cabinet under the stairs, where he kept the first aid kit. The girl hesitated. "Noah," she said. "He just turned 4 last week. We didn't have a cake or nothing, but I told him next time." Her eyes darted around the room as if scanning for threats, escape routes, or both. "You live here alone?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He was busy opening a bottle of children's fever medicine he'd bought 5 years ago and never used, checking the expiration date by the flickering fireplace light. It was still good. He knelt beside the couch and gently tilted Noah's head, coaxing a few sips between his lips. The boy stirred weakly, then coughed a wet, rattling sound that made the girl flinch. Caleb turned to her. "Where's your mother?" he asked, not unkindly. The girl looked down at the floor. "She told us to wait in the car. Said she'd be back. That was 2 nights ago." Her voice was numb now, factual. "I think she got scared. Or maybe she wasn't coming back. I don't know anymore." She took a shaky breath. "I walked all night looking for help. I didn't know which house was safe. Yours had light. And a porch." Caleb stood slowly, studying the girl no more than 9 or 10 shoulders too thin for her age, eyes too old. "What's your name?" She hugged herself tighter. "Ellie," she said. "Ellie Rose." Her voice was firmer now, but her eyes still watched his every move. "Are you going to call someone?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't know yet. All he knew was that something ancient in him, something father-shaped and buried, had cracked wide open the second she said the name Noah. He looked down at the feverish boy again, and then back at Ellie, whose soaked clothes clung like second skin, whose shoes had no business being out in the storm, whose bravery had brought her here. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. First we bring the fever down, then we talk." Ellie nodded once. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry. She sat beside her brother, one hand on his chest, the other wiping rain from his forehead. Caleb walked into the kitchen, put on a kettle for tea, and for the first time in 8 years turned on the second burner. At first, Caleb didn't move. The knock still echoed in his mind like an old bell in a forgotten church tower, soft but insistent, as if someone had reached back into time and rung it just for him. He stood frozen in his flannel pajamas, one hand clenched at his side, the other still gripping the handle of the coffee pot he hadn't yet poured. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, bending the bare trees against the house, and rain lashed against the windows in sharp, rhythmic slaps. He told himself it was a mistake, someone looking for the wrong address, someone desperate but not his responsibility. That's what he always told himself when the phone rang. And he didn't answer when the mailbox filled, and he left it when neighbors waved, and he looked the other way. But something about the knock, its fragility, its rhythm, unnerved him. He waited. Maybe they'd leave. But then it came again. Softer this time. Slower. And with it a whisper barely audible through the wooden door. "Please. Help." It wasn't a grown-up's voice. It wasn't practiced or performative. It was a child's voice, thin and raw like paper about to tear. Caleb inhaled sharply through his nose and took a hesitant step forward. He reached the door, hesitated, and pressed his eye to the peephole. What he saw made him stiffen. A girl small, soaked to the bone, clutching something bundled in cloth, stood shivering on the porch, her face pale under a mop of tangled wet hair. Her lips were purple, her knuckles white where they clung to the bundle, and her eyes, those eyes, were locked on the door like it was her last hope. Caleb's heart kicked against his ribs, unfamiliar with urgency. He unlocked the deadbolt, then paused again, his hand hovering over the knob. If he opened the door, something would shift. Not just tonight. In him. But still. He turned the handle. The door creaked open 3 inches. Cold wind surged in, scattering the edges of the newspaper still lying untouched on the hallway floor. The girl flinched at the sudden light from inside, but didn't step back. She didn't speak at first. Then her mouth moved. "Do you have medicine?" she asked. "He's burning. I don't know what else to do." Caleb looked down at the bundle. A child, limp face, red and glistening with sweat despite the cold. No shoes, no coat, just a towel and trembling limbs. Caleb's mouth worked to form words, but none came. He turned away from the door without a sound and disappeared into the hallway. The girl didn't move. The door stayed open a crack, just wide enough to let out warmth and the scent of coffee. A minute later, Caleb returned with a half-full bottle of children's fever medicine and a plastic syringe. Without a word, he extended it through the gap. She reached forward with one hand, the other still holding the child close to her chest. As she took it, their fingers brushed. Her skin was ice. Caleb started to close the door, but she spoke again. "Please, I think he's worse now. He won't open his eyes. I tried everything I could. I walked for hours." Her voice faltered. "I'm not asking to stay. Just help him, please. Then we'll go." Caleb stared at her words thick in his throat. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't even step forward. She just stood there soaked and desperate, guarding her brother like a soldier with nothing left to lose. The door stayed open for a long moment. Caleb looked past her, saw nothing but the night swallowing the driveway and the rain cutting lines into the porch. He glanced once more at the child's burning face, then back at her. "I have a couch," he said gruffly, voice barely audible. "It's warm. But just for tonight." She nodded once, a sharp, controlled motion. Caleb stepped aside, and for the first time in years, someone crossed his threshold. Caleb hadn't meant to follow her. After all, he'd told himself the night before that it would be just one night, one exception in a life built on silence and separation. But something about the way the girl had refused to sleep, how she'd stayed curled on the edge of the couch all night watching over the boy, her brother, she had said, made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. When dawn broke and she quietly rose, gently wrapped the boy in her arms and whispered, "Thank you." Without looking him in the eye, he thought she was leaving for good. She didn't ask for food or help. She didn't wait for permission. She simply slipped out the door with the same fragile grace she'd entered, disappearing into the misty morning as if she had never been there. But as Caleb stood in the doorway, a steaming mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, something rooted deep in his gut told him not to let her vanish. Not yet. He pulled on his coat, shoved his boots over bare feet, and stepped into the wet grass still glittering with dew. At first he couldn't see her. The trees at the edge of his property, once just a quiet border he never crossed, stood thick and shadowed in the early light. Then he saw a flicker of movement, a flash of red cloth against bark. He followed. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the silence of the woods was so complete that his footsteps sounded intrusive. He moved slower, trying not to startle her if she noticed. It wasn't long before he spotted the shape of a structure nestled behind a thicket of birch and pine. An old storage shed, weathered gray roof, half-caved, barely visible from the road or the edge of his backyard. He hadn't come this way in years. The shed had once belonged to the previous owner long before Caleb bought the house, forgotten, crumbling, left to rot. But someone had made it theirs. As he approached, he noticed the door had been reinforced with a strip of wood and nails crudely hammered. Smoke trickled from a rusted pipe wedged through a broken window pane. Someone had rigged a stove inside. He stopped just before reaching the door and peered through a sliver of broken wall. Inside, the girl was gently laying her brother Noah. She had called him onto a pile of blankets layered over hay. There were bottles lined up on a cracked shelf, most of them empty. A box of saltine crackers, a can of beans, a half-burned candle. The walls were covered with old cloths to block the wind. And in the center of it all, the girl knelt beside the boy and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, her eyes tight with worry. Caleb's breath caught. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was home. Or at least it was the only one they had. He hadn't realized he'd stepped on a branch until it snapped underfoot. The girl spun around, her eyes wide with alarm, but when she saw him, when she realized he had followed, her shoulders sagged not with relief, but with quiet resignation. "You said just one night," she said softly. "Not angry, just tired." "I know," Caleb replied, voice low. "But it's 42 degrees and dropping, and he still has a fever." She didn't answer, didn't move. She looked down at her brother, then back at Caleb. "We've been here a while," she said. Finally. "It's better than where we were before." Caleb's eyes scanned the shed again. No insulation, barely standing, the faint smell of mold creeping in. "You can't stay here," he said. "Not with him that sick." The girl turned back to Noah and brushed damp hair from his forehead. "We don't have anywhere else." Caleb stood there a long moment. Then slowly, quietly, he said, "You do now." The moment Caleb stepped fully into the abandoned shed, the weight of what he saw sank like stone in his chest. It wasn't just the cold or the crumbling walls barely holding back the Kentucky wind, or the sagging roof where light slipped through splintered beams. It was the silence of survival, the absence of everything a home was supposed to be. The air inside was damp, tinged with mildew and old smoke, but beneath that lingered the faint scent of desperation, a smell not everyone could recognize unless they'd walked with grief long enough to know its shape. Sophie watched him tense and silent, one arm half protective over Noah, as if expecting to be told to leave. Caleb didn't speak. He knelt down beside a rusted tin container, where remnants of food supplies had been hoarded with the kind of precision only a child under pressure could manage. A plastic grocery bag held what looked like saltine crackers, broken stale and nearly finished. Next to it sat a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, its lid missing, and a spoon so bent it looked like it had been used as a tool. No cans, no fruit, no protein, no milk, nothing fresh. The candle stub in the corner was barely more than wax, clinging to a wick, and the only light in the space came from two narrow slits in the roof where the early sun cut in. There was no electricity, no humming fridge, no warm bulb overhead, no water either, at least nothing running. A plastic jug in the corner had been refilled again and again, and now it sat bone dry, the cap lying beside it. On a shelf wedged into the corner, he saw a row of mismatched items, a roll of toilet paper wrapped in plastic, a dull pair of scissors, a small book of Bible verses with torn pages, a single match, and what appeared to be a dead flashlight. Caleb moved carefully, his boot crunching over debris and old leaves that had blown in under the door. The blanket Noah was wrapped in was thin, more suited for a summer picnic than a freezing October morning, and the girl's hoodie, soaked from the night before, was still damp on her shoulders. "How long have you been here?" he asked softly, almost not wanting to hear the answer. Sophie hesitated, then said, 3 weeks, maybe 4. She didn't sound sure. Time had blurred for her. Caleb could hear it in the way her voice flattened on the words, like she'd stopped keeping count. "Before that?" he asked. She looked away. "A car. Before that?" "Not here." He didn't press. Instead, he touched the side of the wall and felt the draft slicing through. He imagined the two of them huddled together at night, listening to the wind, trying not to cough too loud in case someone found them. This place wasn't shelter. It was barely a hiding place. "Do you go into town?" Caleb asked. "For food, anything." Sophie shook her head. "I don't want people to know we're here. Last time someone found us?" She trailed off. Her lips tightened. She said nothing more. Caleb nodded once. She didn't have to finish. He understood. He looked at the boy again, at how pale he'd grown overnight. The fever hadn't broken. His breathing was light but strained. "He's dehydrated," Caleb said more to himself than to her. "His lips are dry. No water, no food, no heat. That's not a cold. That's an infection. Maybe pneumonia." Sophie looked at her brother with eyes too old for her age. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered. "I'm trying." That word "trying" echoed in Caleb's mind like a bell. He swallowed hard. He'd spent 8 years doing the opposite, not trying, not helping, not opening any doors. And here she was, this tiny thing dragging a sick child through rain and hunger and cold with no one in the world to care if they made it to morning. His fists clenched. The shed wasn't going to hold another night, and they wouldn't survive another storm. Caleb knew then, standing in the half-light of a place that had once stored garden tools, and now held a whole world of pain, that doing nothing wasn't an option anymore. Sophie sat on the floor of the shed, her legs folded tightly beneath her, as if she were trying to take up less space in a world that had already made her feel too large, too seen, too burdensome. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the frayed blanket that barely covered her brother, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft, Caleb almost missed it. "I did knock," she said. He turned toward her slowly. "What do you mean?" She kept her gaze on the floor, her shoulders rising a little as if she expected to be scolded for even trying. "I knocked on some doors. Before yours. Maybe 4. Maybe 5, I don't remember. It was raining. I was scared. The room grew colder somehow, though the air hadn't changed." Caleb didn't respond yet. He just waited, letting her words come when they were ready. They opened a little. One woman peeked through the curtains. Another cracked it open just a little, saw me holding Noah, and shut it again like I was the wind she didn't want to let in. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It was the worst kind of calm, a calm you only learn after the world teaches you that crying won't change anything. One man told me to go to the clinic, but I don't have a car. I don't even know where the clinic is. She looked up at Caleb, and in that moment, he saw the ache behind her eyes, not just hunger or exhaustion or fear, but something deeper, that bone-deep knowledge that you are alone and no one is coming. I said he had a fever, that I didn't want money, just help, just Tylenol or even just water. But they all shut their doors. Caleb felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself not to look away. He needed to hear this, even if it split him open. The last house had a porch light on, she said. It made me hope. There were pumpkins on the steps. One of them had a candle in it like they were getting ready for Halloween. I thought maybe that meant they were nice. I thought maybe someone with decorations would help a kid. She blinked slowly, but they didn't even open the door. They just yelled through it. Go away. The way she mimicked the tone, it wasn't angry or bitter. It was just a recitation of facts, like the weather, like rain, like being turned away was simply part of the rules now. Caleb couldn't speak. He was remembering the way she'd knocked on his own door, how he'd hesitated, how he'd nearly walked away. And now she sat here with skin too pale and fingers too thin next to a boy burning with fever, telling him in that quiet, unshaken voice that this was not the first time someone had looked through a peephole and decided she didn't matter. I didn't mean to scare anyone, she said after a pause. I didn't want trouble. I just thought someone might still have a heart. Her words landed like thunder inside Caleb's chest. He had once been a man who believed in kindness, who left extra coins in tip jars, who helped change tires on the side of the road. But that was before grief carved out the parts of him that noticed the world, before he taught himself not to feel too much because feeling meant breaking. And now, this girl was sitting in front of him, saying without saying it, that the world had turned away when she needed it most, that she had tried, that it wasn't pride that kept her quiet, it was experience. He knelt beside her and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The apology forming in his throat wasn't just for her. It was for all the doors she had knocked on, for all the people who looked and didn't see, for the part of himself that once would have shut the door too. Caleb never imagined that the sound of laughter could rattle a man's bones more than silence, but as he pushed open the heavy oak door to his home and let Sophie and little Noah step inside, something shifted. The air, once stale with solitude, was pierced by a giggle, high, sudden, and completely unexpected from the baby boy, who had just a day ago burned with fever in a damp shed. Sophie, despite the oversized coat drowning her small frame and the exhaustion pulling down her eyes, managed a sheepish grin as she looked around the cavernous foyer. The floor creaked beneath their muddy shoes, and Caleb had the strange feeling that the house itself had woken up from a long sleep. He didn't say much as he led them into the kitchen. Words still felt fragile in his mouth, but he cleared off the old pine table with methodical urgency, brushing away a stack of unopened mail and faded grocery store ads to make room for the presence of life. The girl took in the wide space, the tall windows still smudged from seasons long past, and the copper kettle on the stove that hadn't whistled in years. Caleb fumbled with the stove, the flicker of flame startling in the quiet, then poured a saucepan of water to boil. "You hungry?" He asked the question stiff, but sincere. Sophie nodded, pulling Noah into her lap as she settled into one of the chairs, and Caleb reached into the pantry searching for anything that didn't expire during Obama's second term. He found a can of soup and a box of crackers and turned his back to open them, but even then he could hear it. The light babble of Noah's voice, not quite words, but full of curiosity, and Sophie's soft laugh as she made a little puppet out of her sleeve to entertain him. It wasn't much, but it was joy raw and spontaneous, slipping through the cracks like sunlight through dusty blinds. Caleb stirred the soup slowly, staring at the swirl of broth, wondering how something so simple could feel like a revolution. For 8 years, this house had held only echoes. He had eaten in silence, walked its halls like a ghost, avoided the room at the end of the hall like it carried a virus he wasn't strong enough to fight. Emma's room. always closed, always still. Now there was a baby teething on a wooden spoon and a girl humming a song she didn't seem to realize she remembered. Caleb set the bowls down one by one, and when Sophie said thank you, her voice didn't tremble. She spoke as if she belonged there. Noah banged the spoon against the table and giggled again, and something about the sound made Caleb pause. His late daughter used to do that tap-the-table laugh at nothing. The memory came like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded but enough to sting. He didn't mention it. Instead, he sat. Just sat watching them eat, letting the warmth spread through the room like a forgotten melody. Later, when Noah toddled across the kitchen floor chasing a rogue cracker and tumbled gently against Caleb's leg, the man didn't recoil. He reached down instinctively, steadied the boy, and found himself saying, "Easy there, champ," before he realized the words had come out of his mouth. Sophie smiled at that. Not the grateful smile she'd worn before, but a real one, amused, knowing soft. It felt like a thaw. Caleb didn't ask where their mother was. Not yet. He didn't ask what had brought them here, or what they were running from. He only knew this for the first time in nearly a decade. There was laughter in the kitchen, steam rising from a shared meal, and a pair of children who didn't flinch when he reached for a glass. He had not planned to let anyone in, but somehow, without his permission, they had cracked something open. And the sound that filled the space wasn't the haunted echo of grief, but the trembling, unfamiliar cadence of hope. That night, as the wind howled outside the farmhouse and the last embers in the fireplace crumbled into ash, the quiet that had momentarily felt warm and alive began to twist into something darker. Caleb lay awake in the armchair, a faded wool blanket draped over his lap, his ears trained toward the hallway where Sophie and Noah slept in the old guest room. At first, there was nothing but the creak of settling beams and the distant sigh of winter wind pressing against the glass. But then, faint, so faint he thought he imagined it, came a soft whimper, and then a hoarse, frantic voice. "Sophie, Sophie!" Caleb bolted upright. He didn't hesitate. He moved faster than he had in years, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor as he crossed the hallway. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, and what he saw inside chilled him deeper than the February air ever could. Noah, flushed and twitching under the covers, was tossing back and forth, soaked in sweat. His cheeks were burning red, his breath shallow and quick, his small fists clutching the edge of the blanket as he cried out again. This time louder, more broken. "Sophie, don't go." Sophie, only half awake herself, had been dozing upright beside him, her chin resting on her knees. At the sound of his voice, she snapped to full attention and leaned over him, stroking his hair, whispering frantically, "I'm here, Noah. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." But her voice trembled with panic, and her wide eyes sought Caleb's figure at the door as though silently begging him for help. Caleb stepped in without a word, his hands already reaching for the boy's forehead. The heat pulsing off Noah's skin was alarming, dangerously high, and the boy's eyes, though open, were glazed over, unfocused, lost in some fever dream from which no comfort could quite pull him back. "He's burning up," Caleb muttered, more to himself than anyone, already pivoting toward the linen closet where he knew an old thermometer and a half-used bottle of children's fever medicine had been buried beneath years of disuse. He returned in seconds, kneeling beside the bed, gently prying Noah's small hand away from the blanket to take his temperature. The digital display beeped softly and lit up 104.7. Too high. Too fast. Sophie clutched her brother tighter, her voice breaking as she said, "He gets like this sometimes when it rains and he's cold too long. Mama used to put him in a bath with cool water and talk to him until it passed." Her words stumbled over memory, and Caleb saw something raw flash across her face, grief, helplessness, desperation that no 12-year-old should ever have to carry. Caleb didn't waste time. He scooped the boy into his arms blankets, and all his frame far lighter than he should have been for his age. Noah whimpered at the movement, calling out once more, "Sophie," even as Caleb whispered back, "She's right behind us, buddy. You hang in there." Down the hall, the bathroom light flickered to life for the first time in ages. Caleb filled the tub with lukewarm water, not cold, just enough to draw out the heat, and gently eased Noah in, still clothed in his damp undershirt and sweatpants. The boy flinched, shuddered, cried out. But then slowly the tremors eased. Sophie knelt on the tile beside the tub, gripping her brother's hand and singing a lullaby so quiet Caleb had to lean in to hear it. It wasn't in English. Something soft and lilting passed from mother to daughter, perhaps long before the world had taught Sophie how cruel it could be. Caleb sat on the edge of the tub, spooning medicine into Noah's mouth, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, watching as the boy's frantic murmurs faded into heavy rhythmic breaths. For the first time in years, Caleb Dawson had someone else's life in his hands, and as Noah finally stilled and Sophie curled up beside him on the bathroom floor, refusing to leave his side, Caleb stayed too. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stayed. Because sometimes the only thing you can give a child who's burning up from more than just fever is the promise that this time someone won't leave. Caleb stood still in the hallway, his hand hovering over the doorknob that hadn't turned in over 8 years, the weight of memory pressing against his chest like a stone. Sophie had wandered down the corridor out of curiosity, her small hand dragging lightly along the wall as she paused in front of the only door that looked different, its edges framed in shadow, its surface dustier than the rest, and just above the brass handle a faded sign in wax crayon, "Do not enter, Emma's room." She didn't touch it, only stared, her brows pinched with quiet confusion, as if sensing something sacred lay beyond. Caleb watched her from behind, silent, his breath caught somewhere between the past and this fragile present. When she turned to look at him, there was no accusation in her face, just a question she didn't speak aloud, a question hanging in the air like the scent of a long-lost perfume. He swallowed hard each second, stretching like a thread pulled too tight, and for a moment he thought of turning away again as he always had. But Sophie didn't push. She just waited. And somehow that waiting, the absence of pressure, was what undid him. "This room," he said hoarsely, his voice rusty from disuse, "used to belong to my daughter." The words hung there sharp and soft all at once, and Sophie's gaze didn't falter. She didn't say she was sorry, didn't recoil, didn't offer some empty kindness the way adults so often did when they didn't know what to do with grief. Instead, she blinked slowly, her voice quiet, and even when she finally said, "You loved her," it wasn't a question. Caleb let out a breath that shivered on the way out. His fingers, calloused and stiff, moved to the key around his neck, worn smooth by years of habit. He slipped it from the cord and unlocked the door with a soft click that echoed in both of them. The hinges groaned as the door creaked open, revealing a room preserved in the amber of memory. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting gentle beams across a bookshelf filled with worn fairy tales. A bed with faded floral sheets neatly made a desk with crayons still resting where small hands had once left them. Nothing had changed. That was the unbearable part. Dust had gathered, but time had not been allowed in. It was a museum to a life interrupted. Sophie stepped forward slowly, her eyes wide, not with excitement, but reverence. She took in the room with quiet awe, the way one might step into a chapel or hear a melody that made them remember something too beautiful and too sad at the same time. Caleb stayed at the threshold, hands trembling slightly, every part of him rigid with the fear of what this moment meant. Sophie turned to him, her eyes searching his face, and for the first time since they met, she spoke not as a child in need, but as someone who understood more than she should have at her age. "You're not a bad man, Caleb," she said, using his name like an offering. "You're just scared." The words hit him harder than any accusation might have. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a girl who had braved the cold with a sick brother, but someone who had already learned too much about people who disappear and promises that don't hold. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, to explain that fear is a wall that grows with silence, that sometimes locking a door is the only way to keep from falling apart. But the truth sat between them, already spoken, and it wasn't shameful, it was human. Sophie stepped to the center of the room, her small fingers brushing against a stuffed rabbit that sat on the windowsill, its ears drooping from age. She liked rabbits, she asked gently. Caleb nodded, clearing his throat. She named that one Buttercup. Sophie smiled at the name, not laughing, just honoring it with her expression. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. The room told its own story, And in that stillness, something shifted. Caleb stepped inside, just 1 foot, then another. The floor didn't collapse beneath him. The memories didn't suffocate. Instead, a new breath entered the spacelight, but real. Sophie looked back at him and said, "Maybe it's okay to remember her out loud." And with that, Emma's room was no longer a tomb. It became a place where the dead were loved, not feared. Caleb didn't speak. He simply nodded and let the door stay open. It happened in a blink one moment. Noah was curled on the couch, sweat cooling on his too pale skin, a damp washcloth on his forehead, Sophie dozing in the chair beside him after a long night of whispering lullabies, and the next something shifted in the silence. Caleb, standing in the kitchen, rinsing out a coffee cup, felt it before he saw it. A strange tightening in his chest, an absence in the air that made him freeze. Then Sophie's voice, small and cracked and terrified. "He's not breathing." The cup shattered as it hit the floor, ceramic splinters flying across the tiles. Caleb was already moving across the room, kneeling beside Noah's still body. The boy's lips were tinged with blue, his chest unmoving, his tiny hands cold to the touch. Panic surged through Caleb's veins like ice water, but his body moved on instinct. "Call 911. He barked to Sophie before remembering there was no landline, no cell signal this far out, not when the storm had knocked the tower days ago. His eyes locked on hers, wide and brimming with tears. "Never mind. Get his coat." He swept Noah into his arms, the boy's head lolling against his shoulder. Too light, too still. Sophie scrambled to grab the thin blanket and the too small jacket that had barely dried from the night before. Caleb didn't wait. He ran. Out the door into the icy rain that hit his face like needles whined, howling like a warning. The world blurred as he sprinted down the gravel path, boots slamming against soaked earth, each breath sharp and burning. The cold cut through his flannel shirt, soaked through to the bone, but he didn't care. He held Noah close, shielding him from the storm with his own body, whispering, "Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me," over and over like a prayer. He didn't know he still remembered. The rain turned the road into sludge, but he didn't slow. The clinic was just under a mile away, a long, twisting path through the woods and past the church. He'd made the walk before, but never like this, never with a child going stiller in his arms by the second. Sophie ran behind him, gasping, slipping her legs pumping with everything. She had eyes locked on her brother. Caleb's lungs burned, heart pounding like it might burst, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't. Lightning cracked the sky, thunder rolling above them like the earth itself was groaning in grief. He reached the main road and turned sharply onto the paved strip leading into town, feet slapping against asphalt-soaked hair plastered to his face. Every step felt like it might be the last, but he tightened his grip around Noah's limp body and pushed harder. The lights of the clinic glowed faintly ahead, 2 yellow eyes through the curtain of rain, and Caleb screamed as he ran, "Help! He's not breathing!" His voice shattered the still morning. Doors burst open. A nurse appeared in scrubs and boots, racing toward them. Caleb fell to his knees on the clinic steps, chest heaving, hands trembling as he tried to pass Noah off without letting go. "Please," he choked out, "please save him." The nurse took the boy with practiced urgency, shouting orders over her shoulder as others rushed in. Sophie collapsed beside Caleb, crying so hard she couldn't breathe, and Caleb wrapped his arm around her without thinking, holding her as tightly as he had held Noah, his hand shaking on her back. Rain soaked them both to the skin, but they didn't move. Inside, machines beeped voices, barked commands, and Caleb stared through the glass door. A man who had spent 8 years locked in grief, now pleading with the universe for one more chance, not for himself, but for 2 children who had appeared on his doorstep and cracked open a door he thought would stay sealed forever. The waiting room of the Willow Creek Medical Clinic was quiet in that awful, suspended way. Time moves when a life hangs in the balance. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a sterile glow over the cheap plastic chairs and outdated magazines. Rain still lashed against the windows in rhythmic bursts, but inside everything felt impossibly still. Caleb sat hunched forward on the edge of his seat, water dripping from the ends of his sleeves, pooling at his boots, His hands clenched so tightly in front of him that his knuckles had turned white. Beside him, Sophie sat motionless, her small frame trembling under the too big hoodie someone had given her, eyes locked on the double doors through which they had taken Noah only moments ago. Caleb's heart beat painfully slow, like it had forgotten its rhythm. He couldn't get the image out of his head. Noah's tiny body limp in his arms, his lips blue, that terrifying stillness. He had run as fast as his body would allow, but what if it hadn't been enough? What if he had been too late? What if the doors burst open? A nurse emerged, soaked in urgency and purpose, but calmer now. Caleb and Sophie both stood at once, eyes wide, not daring to speak. The nurse, a woman in her 40s with kind but tired eyes, glanced between them quickly. "We've stabilized him," she said. "The fever broke with medication, and we've got his breathing regulated. He's still very weak, but he's responding." Caleb's knees buckled slightly in relief, his breath catching like he'd forgotten how to inhale. Sophie made a small sound and covered her mouth with her hands, tears spilling freely now, and Caleb instinctively rested a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Then the nurse looked directly at him and asked, "Are you family? We need consent for treatment." Caleb froze. His mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come out. Not at first. He hadn't thought about this part, not what it would mean to claim something he had no legal right to. He wasn't this child's father. He wasn't even a distant uncle. He was just a man who opened his door because a little girl in the rain had knocked on it. But now, standing here watching Sophie's entire world dangle by a thread through a hospital curtain, something inside him shifted hard and deep. He thought of the way Noah's small hand had clung to his flannel shirt, the way Sophie had curled up at his kitchen table with her head on her arms like she belonged there, like she hadn't been safe in years, until that morning. The words came out broken, hesitant, but they came. I'm his father," Caleb said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. The nurse looked at him for a long second, brows slightly raised. She waited for the clarification, for the explanation, for something more, but Caleb didn't flinch. He held her gaze, every part of him trembling, every cell in his body screaming that this was either a lie or a leap, but it didn't feel like either. It felt like truth, like something ancient and sudden blooming in his chest. "His father," the nurse repeated. Caleb nodded slower this time. I'm his dad," he said again, firmer now, the words burning his throat as they passed. "He's my son." Sophie looked up at him, her tear-streaked face lit by something fierce and wide and full of hope. For a long beat, no one spoke. Then the nurse gave a small nod and said, "Okay. We'll need your signature." She handed him a clipboard, and Caleb took it with shaking fingers. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he wrote his name next to the line marked "Parent or Legal Guardian." Every stroke carved into the page like a vow he hadn't known he was ready to make, but one he wasn't backing away from now. Not anymore. The air in the hospital hallway was thin, almost brittle, as if silence itself were made of glass and could shatter with the faintest word. Caleb sat on the edge of the stiff vinyl chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped but twitching now and then, as if unsure what to do in stillness. Across from him, Sophie sat cross-legged in her oversized hoodie face, pale and unreadable under the dim flicker of the ceiling light. Neither of them had spoken in several minutes, not since the nurse disappeared behind the heavy doors with Noah stabilized, but still unconscious, his small body lost in the tangle of IVs and beeping monitors. Caleb stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, following the lines between tiles like roads that led nowhere. He couldn't shake the feeling of how close they had come, how quickly a tiny, fever-racked body had almost slipped through his arms and into the dark. And for what? Because he hesitated. Because he'd closed himself off for so long that when life knocked again, literally, it took the desperate eyes of a half-frozen girl to get him to open a door he'd locked years ago. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how to raise children. Hell, he hadn't even known how to save his own daughter. The guilt slithered back into his chest, heavy and familiar. He wanted to speak, to tell Sophie something, anything, that Noah would be okay, that she was safe now that somehow the worst was behind them. But words felt inadequate, too brittle for a moment like this. He glanced at Sophie, expecting to see her crumpled in fear or exhaustion, but instead she was looking directly at him, steadily, intently, without blinking. Her face was tired. Yes, streaked with dirt and dried tears, but her eyes were clear in a way that cut through all his doubts. And then, without a single word, she reached out. Her hand, small and cold but deliberate, slid into his. Caleb froze. It was not a dramatic gesture, not the kind you see in movies or read in novels. It was quiet, tentative, almost unsure, but it landed with more force than anything spoken could have. Her fingers didn't grip, just rested gently against his, like she wasn't asking for protection, but offering it. It was not the grasp of a child clinging to an adult for safety, but the silent agreement of two souls who had known too much loss and just maybe were daring to believe in something else. Caleb felt his throat tighten. No one had held his hand since Emma, and even then it had always been him offering comfort, him absorbing her fears, her little hand wrapped around his finger as she drifted to sleep. But this was different. This was Sophie, the girl who had knocked on his door soaked to the bone and refused to beg. The girl who'd carried her baby brother through the cold night because no one else would. The girl who didn't ask for love or promises or miracles, just medicine. And now, without needing an answer, she was giving him something far greater: trust. His hand closed around hers slowly, instinctively, like the final piece of a puzzle slipping into place. He didn't squeeze, didn't speak, didn't promise anything. But in that moment, something in the air between them shifted. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt full of everything they couldn't say, full of the aching spaces where words failed, full of the soft, unbearable weight of survival. Caleb didn't need to be told what her gesture meant. She was telling him, "I see you. I know you're scared, but you stayed. You came. And that's enough. For now." He looked down at their joined hands, at the rawness of it, the beauty of it, and something unfamiliar moved in his chest. Not grief, not fear, something softer, warmer, like the beginning of belief. The morning light crept through the thin linen curtains like a whisper, brushing the corners of the once-forgotten room with soft gold. It was warmer now, not just because the thermostat had been fixed days ago, but because something invisible had shifted within the house itself, as if the walls were beginning to breathe again after years of holding their breath. The silence that used to wrap around Caleb like a shroud was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. It had changed, less of a void, more of a stillness between heartbeats. Somewhere down the hallway, faint shuffling could be heard, the light patter of small feet against old hardwood. Caleb stood quietly in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, the smell of toast already filling the space. He didn't know where the girl had gone off to, but he didn't worry the way he used to. She always came back. A moment later, something tugged at him, an instinct, an invisible pull. He followed the faint scuffing sounds until he reached the once-locked door. Emma's room, or perhaps now not only hers. He hesitated, but only for a moment, then stepped inside. The room looked different. Not much had changed in terms of furniture. It was still tidy, still preserved with that museum-like reverence of grief. But the air felt lighter, and in the soft light, something on the far wall caught his eye. Sophie was crouched there, crayon in hand, head bent in concentration. Her knees were folded beneath her like a fawn, and her small fingers gripped the waxy red crayon with careful purpose. She didn't flinch when she noticed him standing in the doorway. She didn't ask for permission. She simply kept drawing. Caleb stepped closer slowly, and his eyes followed the soft arcs and lines until the message came into view, scrawled in big, uneven letters across the blank white wall. Noah, Sophie, Caleb. The names weren't perfectly spelled. Sophie's name was tilted the E like a question mark, and Caleb had a backwards B, but none of it mattered. The wall had never been touched in 8 years, had remained frozen in time with pastel butterflies and soft pink decals. But now across its middle, bold and undeniable, were 3 names joined by hyphens, like an equation, like a claim. Sophie had staked something sacred here, had declared with color what none of them had been able to say aloud. We are here, we exist, we belong together. Caleb didn't speak. His throat tightened as if the names themselves had lodged there. The girl beside him didn't glance up for approval. She simply added a small red heart beneath the names Crooked and Brave. Then standing up, she dusted her hands and gave him a look. Not a smile, not a question, just a knowing, quiet, and sure. Caleb nodded, swallowing against the rising wave in his chest. There were no signatures in his house before, no marks of life, no claims of togetherness. But now, in one bold crayon red line, this girl had written them into existence. Not just guests, not just survivors, a family even if no one else would call it that. She had carved it in wax right into the wall, right into him. The kitchen, once a hollow space of silence and mechanical routine, now pulsed with something unfamiliar life. The light above the table was warm golden, not the harsh fluorescent Caleb had grown used to in his solitude, but a soft glow that seemed to stretch and fold itself around the room like a gentle embrace. The air was filled with the scent of toast and eggs and something faintly sweet, cinnamon maybe, from the box of oatmeal Sophie had found in the back of the pantry and insisted on trying. The chairs around the small kitchen table, which for years had remained untouched except for Caleb's solitary seat, were now all occupied. 3 of them. 3. Caleb sat on the end, still in his flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up, halfway, coffee mug in hand, not saying much but not needing to. Across from him, Sophie was eating in that deliberate way she had, carefully cutting her toast with the side of her fork, even though it didn't need cutting, her brows furrowed like she was solving a quiet problem only she could see. Beside her in the booster seat Caleb had borrowed from the clinic's back room 2 days earlier, Noah sat swaying gently in rhythm with the hum of the heater vent, his face flushed but peaceful, a smear of oatmeal on his chin. The boy didn't say much, hadn't yet said anything really, but he watched, always watched, his eyes moving between his sister and Caleb, with the wide, solemn gaze of someone slowly mapping unfamiliar terrain. No one spoke for a while, but the silence was no longer stiff or unbearable. It felt full, like the space between waves, like breath. Caleb reached for the sugar bowl without thinking and passed it across the table. Sophie took it without a word, added a spoonful to her oatmeal, then pushed it gently toward Noah's side as if it were a natural thing. A quiet choreography built not from instructions, but from observation and shared rhythm. Caleb didn't even realize he was smiling until he caught his reflection in the window, soft, almost shy, like someone seeing himself for the first time in a long while. The 3rd chair had once been a placeholder for grief, always empty, always there to remind him of what was gone. Now it held a child with wild hair and a quiet resolve who had drawn his name on a wall and unknowingly pulled him back into the world he had long left behind. Nothing grand had changed. The table was still scuffed. The clock still ticked too loudly. The refrigerator still made that humming noise he kept meaning to fix. But there was light and warmth, and 3 chairs filled. That alone felt like something sacred. Caleb sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him, and looked around the table one more time. Not as a stranger in his own home, not as a man counting what he'd lost, but as someone slowly, cautiously beginning to believe he might be part of something again. The kitchen, for the first time in 8 years, felt like a home, not a place of ghosts, but of beginnings, of mornings, of 3 chairs all filled. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't echo with loneliness anymore, but rested in the soft hush of belonging. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting dancing shadows across the worn floorboards and the stone mantel above. Caleb stood there for a long while, holding the photo frame in both hands. His fingers curled tightly around the edges, as if afraid the moment might slip away if he let go too soon. It wasn't anything grand, just a snapshot taken the day before by the clinic nurse, a kind woman who had insisted on capturing the unlikely trio after Noah had finally smiled for the first time. Sophie had squinted in the sunlight, her arm around her brother's thin shoulders, her other hand reaching for Caleb's. Caleb, still unsure of where he belonged in the frame, had stood stiffly at first, but somehow, by the time the shutter clicked, his hand had found its way onto Noah's back and something unspoken had settled between them like a quiet truce with the past. Now he stared at that photo, the 3 of them, awkward, uneven, imperfect, but real, alive. He looked to his right at the photo that had never left its place on the mantel in all these years. Emma, his daughter. Her bright eyes frozen in time, her laughter caught forever in the tilt of her head, the way her curls refused to be tamed. The photo had always stood alone, unchallenged, sacred, surrounded by dust and silence. For 8 years, Caleb had spoken to her in whispers, asked her forgiveness in half sentences, promised he would never let her memory fade. And yet, here he was, holding another frame, another claim to something that felt like family. He hesitated. The weight of that decision, it wasn't just wood and glass, it was permission. Permission to move, to feel, to begin again without betraying the love that came before. He cleared a small space beside Emma's photo. Not in front of it, not pushing it aside, but beside it, equal, not replacing. A continuation, not a substitution. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the new photo down. The fire's glow caught the glass, reflecting the smiling faces back at him, Sophie's quiet defiance, Noah's fragile peace, his own reluctant, almost accidental warmth. For the first time, the mantle didn't feel like a shrine to grief. It felt like a story, one with chapters, with memory, and now with possibility. Caleb stood back and looked at both frames. He imagined Emma watching from wherever she might be, imagined her smile, her voice saying something like, "Took you long enough, Dad." He let out a shaky breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and sat down in the armchair nearby. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like it had room for the living. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. The photo said enough: a girl, a boy, and a man who had once forgotten how to live, and now maybe was learning again. Family is not where you were born, it's where someone chooses to stay. That voice, soft and steady, rises not from a single mouth, but from the stillness between 3 chairs at a kitchen table, from the warmth of a flickering fire, beside 2 photographs that now live side by side. It is not the voice of Caleb alone, nor Sophie or Noah, but something greater, the quiet truth that has taken root in this once hollow house. You see, Caleb had lived for 8 years among ghosts, clinging to shadows of what once was convinced that to honor the dead meant refusing anything new. He thought grief demanded solitude, that love ended when the person was gone. But then one morning a knock, faint, uncertain, pulled him back into the world. And in that freezing rain he saw not just a girl with muddy shoes and a sick baby, but a mirror of need, of strength, of fear, hidden behind fiercely guarded silence. He could have closed the door. He nearly did. But something, perhaps his daughter's memory, perhaps just the echo of loneliness, made him pause. And that pause became a step, a gesture, a half-open door. Sophie never asked for more than help, but she brought something with her that neither of them could name at the time. She brought presence. Not perfection, not answers, just the stubborn choice to remain. Through Noah's fever, through the cold nights in a broken house, through awkward meals and unsaid words, she didn't leave. And Caleb, who hadn't let anyone in since the day they buried Emma, began quietly, clumsily to stay too. Not out of obligation, not because of blood, but because he saw something in Sophie's eyes that was too familiar to ignore the knowledge of what it meant to be left behind. Slowly, the routines changed. The silence gave way to the scrape of forks against plates, to the shuffle of small feet in the hall. Light returned to rooms that had been dark for nearly a decade. The locked door was opened. The photo placed. The mantle made room for more than grief. And now, as the house settles into its new rhythm, as night falls over the woods beyond the window, and the wind hums gently against the glass, the voice speaks again, not loud, not grand, but full. Family is not the place we're born. It's not tied to blood or paperwork. It's not found in last names or hospital records. It's carved in the quiet moments when someone shows up and keeps showing up. When they see you, not just your pain, not just your scars, but all of you. And they choose to stay. In the end, it wasn't Emma's death that broke Caleb. It was the silence that followed. And it wasn't medicine or memory that saved him. It was a girl with a crayon in her hand, writing 3 names on a kitchen wall, as if to say, we were here, we mattered, and no one left. That is family. Not where you come from, but where someone stays, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when there's every reason to run. They stay, and so a house becomes a home again. Not because it is full, but because it is no longer empty. Sometimes in life we think healing has to come through grand gestures, through speeches, through big decisions, through perfect moments. But most of the time healing arrives quietly. It knocks on your door in the form of a need you didn't expect, or a person you never planned to meet. Like Caleb, many of us shut the world out after pain. We think if we close the door tight enough, we won't hurt again. But the truth is, grief doesn't need silence. It needs presence. This story reminds us that family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who chooses to stay. It's about showing up when it's uncomfortable and sitting beside someone in the dark without asking them to be okay right away. Whether it's a child in need or someone in your life who's quietly breaking the smallest act of staying can change everything. If you've been building walls to protect your heart, maybe today is the day to crack open a window, let someone in, or be the one who stays when everyone else walks away. Because in the end, love isn't proven by promises, it's proven by presence. So ask yourself, who have you stayed for, and who's stayed for you? That's your real family. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who stayed when others didn't drop a comment and share your story, if you believe the world needs more of this kind of love, save this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what really matters.